In 1992, the Whitmore family, Thomas, his wife Claire, and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie, vanished without a trace from a lakeside birthday celebration in Pine Ridge, Oregon. 40 guests watched them walk toward the parking lot to retrieve candles for the cake. None of them ever returned. But 23 years later, a construction crew demolishing the old Pine Ridge Community Center would uncover something in the crawl space beneath the building. Something that would turn everything investigators thought they knew about that spring afternoon into a nightmare far darker than anyone could have imagined. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unexplained disappearances, consider subscribing. These stories need to be told. The afternoon sun sparkled across Mirror Lake on May 16, 1992, casting dancing reflections on the water's surface. The Pine Ridge Community Center, a modest wood-paneled building overlooking the lake, buzzed with the cheerful chaos of a children's birthday party. Pink and yellow balloons bobbed against the ceiling, and the smell of hot dogs and potato salad filled the air. Claire Whitmore stood near the refreshment table, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, watching her twin daughters dart between clusters of adults. Emma and Sophie, turning 7 today, wore matching lavender dresses that Claire had sewn herself, though Emma had already managed to smudge dirt on her hem. The girls' laughter rang out as they played tag with their classmates from Riverside Elementary. Thomas Whitmore worked the grill outside on the deck, flipping burgers and chatting with other fathers from the neighborhood. At 34, he was a high school chemistry teacher known for his terrible dad jokes and his dedication to coaching youth soccer. His wire-rimmed glasses kept sliding down his nose in the spring humidity. Nearly 40 people had gathered for the celebration: neighbors, school friends, Thomas's colleagues from Pine Ridge High, Claire's book club members. It was the kind of wholesome community gathering that defined their small Oregon town, population 3,200. At approximately 3:47 p.m., according to witness statements later compiled by investigators, Claire approached her husband at the grill. She spoke quietly to him, and several witnesses observed Thomas nodding. The couple then called to their daughters, who came running across the lawn. "We need to get the number candles from the car," Claire explained to her friend Jennifer Hayes, who stood nearby holding her own toddler. "I can't believe I forgot them. We'll be right back." The 4 Whitmores walked together toward the gravel parking lot, visible from the community center's large windows. Emma skipped ahead while Sophie held her mother's hand. Thomas had his arm around Claire's shoulders. Multiple witnesses saw them reach their blue 1989 Honda Accord, parked near the edge of the lot beneath a cluster of Douglas fir trees. Thomas opened the trunk. Claire leaned in, apparently searching for something. Then, according to 3 separate witnesses, the family simply walked behind a maintenance shed at the far end of the parking lot, a small structure used to store lawn equipment for the community center grounds. They never emerged. When 15 minutes passed, Jennifer Hayes walked to the parking lot to check on them. The Honda sat undisturbed, trunk still open, keys dangling from the lock. The number 7 birthday candles lay on the ground beside the rear tire, their package torn open. Jennifer called out, receiving no response. She walked behind the maintenance shed, finding only overgrown grass leading down to a service road that wound behind the property. The Whitmore family had vanished. Within 2 hours, Pine Ridge Police Department had officers combing the area. By nightfall, the FBI had been contacted. Search dogs tracked the family's scent from the parking lot behind the shed, then lost the trail at the service road, suggesting they had entered a vehicle. But no one had seen another car. No one had heard an engine start. No one had witnessed anything unusual except a family walking behind a shed and disappearing from the face of the earth. The birthday cake, decorated with Sleeping Beauty characters, remained uncut on the community center table. The presents sat unopened, and 40 witnesses could offer no explanation for how 4 people could vanish in broad daylight from a location surrounded by friends and family. The demolition crew arrived at the old Pine Ridge Community Center at dawn on October 12, 2015. The building had been condemned for 2 years, deemed structurally unsound after a particularly harsh winter had compromised its foundation. The town council had finally approved funds to tear it down and build a new recreational facility in its place. Ray Martinez, foreman of Cascade Demolition Company, walked the perimeter of the building as his crew prepared their equipment. The structure looked even more decrepit than he remembered. Paint peeling in long strips, windows boarded up. The deck where families had once gathered for barbecues now rotted through in places. "Start with the interior walls," Ray instructed his team. "Work from the inside out, and watch for asbestos. This thing was built in the 70s. By mid-morning, the crew had gutted most of the main hall. The work went smoothly until Miguel Santos, operating a small excavator, noticed something unusual. The floor in the northwestern corner of the building seemed to give way more easily than it should have, almost hollow sounding. "Ray," Miguel called out, climbing down from his machine. "Come look at this." Ray crossed the debris-strewn floor to where Miguel stood near what had once been the kitchen area. Miguel stomped his boot on the floorboards, producing a distinctly hollow echo. "Crawl space," Miguel suggested. Ray knelt down, running his gloved hands along the seam where the floor met the wall. Most of the building sat on a concrete slab foundation, but this section appeared different. He pulled up a section of rotted plywood, revealing darkness below. "Get me a flashlight," Ray said. The beam of light revealed a space roughly 4 feet deep, extending about 10 feet in each direction. The earth below was packed hard, and the air that rose from the opening smelled of damp soil and decay. Not unusual for a crawl space that had been sealed for decades. But then Ray's flashlight beam caught something that made his breath stop. Fabric. Blue fabric, partially buried in the dirt. "Miguel, call the police," Ray said, his voice suddenly tight. "Right now. Don't let anyone else near this area." 45 minutes later, Detective Laura Chen stood at the edge of the opened crawl space, her dark eyes studying the scene below. At 39, she'd been with Pine Ridge Police Department for 11 years, making her way up from patrol officer to the detective division. She'd grown up in this town, attended parties in this very building as a child. "We need forensic teams," she said to Officer Marcus Webb, who stood beside her making notes. "Seal the entire structure. No one else comes in until we process this scene." Laura's mind was already racing through possibilities. The building had been closed for 2 years, but before that, it had hosted community events for over 4 decades. People had been in and out constantly. The crawl space, however, appeared to have been sealed, intentionally concealed beneath the floor. By early afternoon, the Oregon State Police Forensic Unit had arrived. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the state's lead forensic anthropologist, descended into the crawl space with portable lighting and careful, methodical movements. Laura watched from above as Dr. Reeves photographed and examined the site. The blue fabric turned out to be a woman's dress, or what remained of one. As Dr. Reeves carefully excavated the surrounding soil, more items emerged. A man's wristwatch, small shoes, children's shoes, and then, unmistakably, bone. "We have multiple individuals," Dr. Reeves called up, her voice professionally calm but carrying an undercurrent of gravity. "Adult and juvenile remains. This is going to take time to process properly." Laura felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm October afternoon. Multiple bodies, including children, hidden beneath a community building where families had gathered for decades. She pulled out her phone and called Chief Robert Brennan. "Chief, we have a situation at the community center site," she said. "Multiple human remains. I need you to pull all missing persons cases for Pine Ridge and surrounding areas going back as far as we have records." As she ended the call, Laura's gaze drifted across the property toward the old parking lot, now overgrown with weeds. She'd been 12 years old in 1992, old enough to remember when the Whitmore family disappeared. The story had haunted Pine Ridge for years, becoming the town's most infamous, unsettling mystery. 4 people vanishing from a birthday party in broad daylight. Laura had never forgotten the search parties that combed the woods for weeks, the FBI agents conducting interviews, the candlelight vigil held at the high school where Thomas Whitmore had taught. She looked down into the crawl space where Dr. Reeves continued her careful work, and a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. "Marcus," she said to the young officer, "get me everything we have on the Whitmore disappearance. Files, witness statements, evidence logs, everything." Marcus's eyes widened with understanding. "You think—" "I don't think anything yet," Laura cut him off, though her gut told her otherwise. "But I want those files on my desk within the hour." The Pine Ridge Police Department occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, wedged between the public library and a hardware store that had been family-owned for 3 generations. Laura sat at her desk in the detective division, surrounded by file boxes that smelled of old paper and dust. The Whitmore case files filled 4 boxes, compiled over the 2 years that the investigation had remained active before being classified as cold. Laura had spent the past 3 hours reading through witness statements, reviewing photographs, studying the timeline that investigators had painstakingly constructed. May 16, 1992, a Saturday afternoon, clear skies, temperature in the mid-60s. 42 people present at Emma and Sophie Whitmore's 7th birthday party. Not a single one could explain what happened. Laura studied the crime scene photographs from that day, the abandoned Honda Accord, trunk open, birthday candles scattered on the ground, the maintenance shed behind which the family had disappeared, the service road that wound behind the property. The lead investigator had been Detective Frank Morrison, now retired and living in Arizona. His notes were meticulous, his frustration evident in the margins where he'd written questions that had never been answered. "Why walk behind the shed?" Morrison had written. "Direct route to parking lot from building. Why detour? No vehicle sounds reported by any witness. How did they leave the property? Girl's fingerprints on trunk lid, reached in with mother, normal behavior. No signs of distress." Laura leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes to visualize the scene. A family of 4, in the middle of their daughter's birthday party, walks to their car to retrieve candles. They open the trunk, find the candles, package torn open, suggesting they'd handled them, then walk behind a maintenance shed and vanish. No blood, no signs of struggle, no ransom demand ever received. Bank accounts never touched. Thomas's car never driven again. A knock on her door frame made Laura open her eyes. Chief Brennan stood there, his weathered face grave. At 61, he was 3 years from retirement, and the weight of decades in law enforcement showed in the lines around his eyes. "Dr. Reeves called," he said, entering the office and closing the door behind him. "Preliminary findings from the remains." Laura sat up straighter, waiting. 4 individuals, Brennan continued, settling into the chair across from her desk. 2 adults, 2 children. Female adult, male adult. 2 female juveniles, approximately 6 to 8 years old based on dental development. The room felt suddenly colder. "Age of remains?" Laura asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Consistent with 20 to 25 years of burial. Dr. Reeves will need dental records and DNA for positive identification, but Laura—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "One of the juvenile skulls shows evidence of blunt force trauma. Both adult remains show similar injuries. This wasn't natural death." Laura felt her stomach turn. She'd investigated murders before. Pine Ridge wasn't immune to violence despite its small-town charm. But this was different. These were people she'd grown up hearing about, whose faces had stared out from missing person posters for years. "The crawl space," she said. "Someone would have needed access to create it. The building's construction records." "Already on it," Brennan interrupted. "The community center underwent renovation in 1991. New kitchen installed, floors reinforced in some areas. I've got Marcus pulling the contractor records and building permits." Laura turned to her computer, pulling up the timeline she'd been constructing. The birthday party was May 16, 1992. If the renovations happened in 1991, that crawl space could have been created during that work. Or after, Brennan added. The building wasn't used every day. Someone with access could have done the work gradually. Who had keys to the community center? Laura asked, reaching for her notepad. Brennan pulled out his own notes. In 1992, the building was managed by the Pine Ridge Parks and Recreation Department. Director was Harold Finch, died in 2003. Administrative assistant was Ruth Morrison, moved to California in 1995. Maintenance staff included 3 people, Gerald Voss, Peter Chen, and Martin Oakes. Laura wrote down the names. Are any of them still local? Voss died in 2007. Chen moved to Portland. I have an address for him. Oakes still lives here, works as a groundskeeper at Riverside Elementary, the elementary school where Emma and Sophie Whitmore had been students. Laura met Brennan's eyes. I want to talk to Martin Oakes, and I need the guest list from that birthday party. Every single person who was there needs to be re-interviewed. Laura, Brennan said carefully, this was 23 years ago. People's memories. Someone knows something, Laura interrupted, her voice firm. A family doesn't vanish in front of 40 witnesses unless someone helped make it happen. And whoever put those bodies under that floor had access to that building, probably had construction knowledge and managed to do it without anyone noticing. She stood, gathering the files. That takes planning. That takes opportunity. That takes someone who belonged there, who wouldn't raise suspicion by being in the building. Brennan nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, we'll have preliminary DNA results. If it's the Whitmores, when it's confirmed, Laura said, correcting him gently. This becomes a quadruple homicide investigation, and somewhere in this town, someone who was at that party, or worked at that building, or had connection to that family, knows what really happened. She looked down at the photograph on her desk. Thomas, Claire, Emma, and Sophie Whitmore, smiling at the camera in their Christmas portrait from 1991. The last family photo taken before they disappeared. I'm going to find out who did this, Laura said quietly. Those girls deserve to have their 7th birthday. They deserve to grow up. Brennan stood, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. I know you will. But Laura, be prepared. When we reveal that those remains are the Whitmores, this whole town is going to relive that nightmare. People thought they'd escaped, that maybe the family was alive somewhere. Finding out they were dead all along, hidden right beneath where we held community events for decades. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Laura understood perfectly. The horror wasn't just that a family had been murdered. It was that their bodies had been beneath the community center the entire time, while life went on above them. While children played at birthday parties, while families celebrated holidays, while the town gathered and laughed and lived. The Whitmores had been there all along, waiting to be found. Martin Oakes lived in a small ranch house on Elderberry Lane, a quiet street lined with mature oak trees that created a canopy over the cracked sidewalk. Laura pulled up to the curb at 8 the next morning, accompanied by Officer Marcus Webb. The house needed paint, and the yard showed signs of careful but aging maintenance. Flower beds edged precisely, grass trimmed short, but the fence sagging in places. An older man answered the door after the second knock. Martin Oakes was 71 now, his hair completely white, his shoulders slightly stooped. But his eyes were sharp and clear as they studied Laura's badge. Mr. Oakes, I'm Detective Chen with Pine Ridge Police. This is Officer Webb. We'd like to ask you some questions about your work at the community center. Something flickered across Martin's face. Not quite fear, but recognition that this moment had been coming. You found them, didn't you? Under the floor. Laura kept her expression neutral. May we come in? Martin stepped aside, allowing them into a living room that was neat but sparse. Photographs covered one wall. Martin with a woman Laura assumed was his late wife, based on the obituary Marcus had found during background research. Children and grandchildren in various stages of life. I knew when I saw the demolition notice in the paper, Martin said, settling into a worn armchair. I knew they'd find them eventually. I've been waiting 23 years. Laura exchanged a glance with Marcus, who had his notebook ready. Mr. Oakes, I need to inform you of your rights before we continue this conversation. I didn't kill them, Martin said flatly, but I know who did, and I've carried that knowledge like a stone around my neck for over 2 decades. After reading him his Miranda rights, which Martin waived with a signature, Laura sat forward on the couch. Tell me what you know. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in his lap. I was the groundskeeper at the community center. Maintenance work, keeping the building running. I'd been there since 1985. It was good, honest work. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window where morning light filtered through thin curtains. May 16th, 1992. I wasn't scheduled to work that day. The Whitmore party was a private rental, but I got a call that morning from Harold Finch. He was the director then. Said the kitchen sink was backing up and could I come fix it before the party started. What time did you arrive? Laura asked. Around 1 o'clock. The party wasn't supposed to start until 2:30. I went to the kitchen, found the problem. Just a clog, nothing serious. I was finishing up when I heard someone else come into the building. Martin's face had gone pale, his hands now gripping the armrests of his chair. I looked out from the kitchen and saw Samuel Finch in the main hall, Harold's son. He was 32 then, worked for his father, sometimes doing repairs and renovations. He didn't see me at first. He was looking at the floor in the northwest corner, measuring something. Laura's pulse quickened. What happened then? I asked him what he was doing. Startled him. He said his father had asked him to check the floor supports in that area, make sure they'd hold for the party. Seemed reasonable enough. Samuel was always around the building, helping with projects. Nobody questioned it. Did you see him again that day? Marcus asked. Martin nodded slowly. During the party. He showed up around 3:30, said he was there to help with cleanup afterward. His father had requested it. But the thing is, I saw Harold later, and he looked surprised that Samuel was there. Said he hadn't asked him to come. Where was Samuel during the party? Laura pressed. Outside, mostly, smoking cigarettes by the service road. I remember because I went out to my truck to get a tool and I saw him there, just leaning against the maintenance shed, watching the parking lot. The maintenance shed, where the Whitmores had disappeared behind. What time was this? Laura asked carefully. Right around when the Whitmores went missing. Maybe 3:45. I remember because I just looked at my watch, thinking I could leave soon since the sink was fixed. Laura pulled out a photograph. Samuel Finch's driver's license photo from 1992, obtained from DMV records earlier that morning. Is this the man you saw? Martin looked at the photo and his jaw tightened. That's him, Samuel Finch. Mr. Oakes, why didn't you come forward with this information 23 years ago? Martin's eyes filled with tears. Because 2 days after the Whitmores disappeared, Samuel came to my house. He knew where I lived. He sat right where you're sitting and he told me if I ever mentioned seeing him at the community center that day, he'd make sure my grandchildren disappeared too. Showed me pictures he'd taken of my daughter's kids playing in their yard. His voice broke. He said he'd already proven he could make a whole family vanish in broad daylight. What chance did 2 little kids have? I had to protect them. I had to stay quiet. Where is Samuel Finch now? Laura asked, though she suspected the answer. Dead, Martin said bitterly. Died in a car accident in 1998. Wrapped his truck around a tree on Highway 26, drunk out of his mind. Everyone said it was tragic. I thought it was justice, finally. But it didn't bring those people back. He leaned forward, his face anguished. I knew they were dead. I knew they were under that building. And for 23 years, I went to the grocery store, to church, to my grandkids' school events. And I carried that knowledge. I'm 71 years old, Detective. I've had cancer twice. I should have died before those bodies were found. Should have taken that secret to my grave. But here we are. Laura's phone buzzed. A text from Chief Brennan. DNA confirmed. It's the Whitmores. All 4. She looked at Martin Oakes, this elderly man who'd lived with unbearable knowledge for over 2 decades and felt a complex mixture of anger and pity. Mr. Oakes, I need you to come to the station and make a formal statement. Everything you know about Samuel Finch, about that day, about the threats he made. Will I be charged? Martin asked quietly. That's not my decision, Laura replied honestly. But you've withheld evidence in a quadruple homicide investigation for 23 years. There will be consequences. Martin nodded, looking almost relieved. I understand. I've been expecting this day for a long time. Maybe now I can finally sleep without seeing those little girls' faces from the photographs, wondering what happened to them in their last moments. As they drove Martin to the station, Laura's mind raced through the implications. Samuel Finch had been at the community center, measuring the floor where the bodies would later be found. He'd been near the maintenance shed when the Whitmores disappeared. He'd threatened Martin Oakes into silence. But Samuel Finch had been dead for 17 years. He couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be questioned, couldn't provide answers to the questions that haunted Laura. How had he made 4 people disappear in front of 40 witnesses? Where had he taken them? How had he killed them? And, most disturbingly, had he acted alone? The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. Chief Brennan stood at the podium in the Pine Ridge City Hall Council chambers, facing a room packed with journalists, residents, and television cameras. Laura stood to the side, watching as the chief delivered the news that would shatter whatever peace the town had managed to build over the past 2 decades. This morning, we received DNA confirmation that the remains discovered at the former community center site are those of Thomas and Claire Whitmore and their daughters Emma and Sophie. After 23 years, we can confirm that the Whitmore family did not leave Pine Ridge voluntarily. They were victims of homicide. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions while cameras flashed. Several older residents in the audience began crying. People who had known the Whitmores, who had attended the search parties, who had never stopped wondering. Laura noticed a woman in the back row, mid-50s, her face drained of color. Jennifer Hayes, according to the name tag she wore from the elementary school where she worked as a counselor. The friend who had discovered the abandoned car that day. After the press conference ended, Laura approached her. Mrs. Hayes, I'm Detective Chen. I'd like to speak with you about the day the Whitmores disappeared. Jennifer's hands shook as she gathered her purse. I knew, she whispered. When I heard about the remains, I knew it was them, but hoping they were alive somewhere, even if they'd left for reasons we didn't understand. That was easier than this. They found a quiet conference room down the hall. Jennifer sat heavily in a chair, pulling a tissue from her purse. You were Claire's closest friend, Laura said gently, reviewing her notes. You were at the party that day. We met through PTA, Jennifer said, her voice thick with emotion. Our kids were in the same class. Claire was sunshine, you know, always organizing bake sales, volunteering, making everyone feel included. Thomas was the same way. They were genuinely good people. Walk me through that afternoon, Laura requested. Everything you remember. Jennifer closed her eyes, and Laura could see her mentally returning to that spring day 23 years ago. The party was lovely. The girls were so excited, wearing those matching dresses Claire made. They'd been planning it for weeks. Claire had this whole theme. She'd made a treasure hunt game, had goodie bags for all the kids. What time did they go to the car? Around 3:45. We were getting ready to bring out the cake, and Claire suddenly realized she'd forgotten the number candles. She was so upset with herself. You know how it is when you're hosting. Everything has to be perfect. Thomas said it was no problem. They'd just run to the car and be back in 5 minutes. Jennifer's voice caught. I watched them walk to the parking lot. All 4 of them. Sophie was holding Claire's hand. Emma was skipping ahead. They looked so happy. Did you see anyone else in the parking lot? Any other vehicles? No, it was just their car and a few others. Most people had parked on the street because the lot was small. Laura pulled out a photograph. Do you recognize this man? Samuel Finch. Jennifer studied the photo, frowning. He looks familiar. Maybe I saw him around town, but I don't remember him being at the party. Was he someone the Whitmores knew? Not that Claire ever mentioned. She would have told me if... Jennifer stopped, her eyes widening. Wait, there was something. Maybe a month before the party, Claire said something about a man who'd been watching the girls at their soccer practice. She reported it to the police, but they said without any direct contact, there wasn't much they could do. Just to stay vigilant. Laura leaned forward. Did she describe this man? Tall, she said, dark hair, drove a blue pickup truck. She said he never approached the girls, just sat in his truck watching the field. It happened 3 or 4 times, then stopped. Laura's mind raced. Samuel Finch had owned a blue pickup truck. It was the vehicle he died in 6 years later. She made a note to pull traffic camera footage from 1992, though she knew it was unlikely any existed. Mrs. Hayes, in the days or weeks before the disappearance, did Claire seem worried about anything? Did she mention any problems, any concerns? Jennifer thought carefully. She was stressed about Thomas's mother. She'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's, and Claire was trying to figure out how they'd manage care for her, and... She paused. There was something else. Claire mentioned that someone had been calling their house and hanging up. It happened several times over a few weeks. She thought it might be a wrong number, but it bothered her. Did she report it? I don't think so. This was before caller ID was common. There wasn't much anyone could do about hang-up calls. Laura made detailed notes. A pattern was emerging. Samuel Finch hadn't just randomly selected the Whitmore family. He'd been watching them, following them, calling them, planning. One more question, Laura said. The maintenance shed behind the parking lot. Do you remember if it was always kept locked? Jennifer shook her head. No, it was usually open during events. The grounds crew needed access to lawn equipment. It was just a small shed, nothing valuable inside. After Jennifer left, Laura returned to the station. Marcus had compiled additional information about Samuel Finch. Employment records, known associates, criminal history. Samuel had been arrested twice in the 1980s for stalking. Both cases dismissed when the victims dropped their complaints. He'd worked sporadically for his father's parks department, but had no steady employment. Neighbors from his last known residence described him as strange, antisocial, someone who kept odd hours and showed no interest in forming relationships. Dr. Reeves called just after 5 o'clock with updated findings from the remains. Laura put her on speaker so Chief Brennan could listen from his office next door. The cause of death for all 4 victims was blunt force trauma to the head, Dr. Reeves reported, her clinical tone not quite masking the gravity of what she was describing. Based on the fracture patterns, I believe they were struck from behind, possibly while kneeling or sitting. The attacks were quick and efficient. Suggesting they were taken somewhere, restrained, then killed, Laura said. That's consistent with the evidence. I also found trace fibers on the clothing, industrial carpet fibers, the kind used in commercial vehicles, and something else. Laura waited. All 4 victims had ligature marks on their wrists and ankles, post-mortem bruising suggesting they'd been bound before death. The children's remains showed defensive wounds on their hands. They tried to protect themselves. Laura closed her eyes. The horror of those final moments, almost too much to process. 2 7-year-old girls, tied up, watching their parents murdered, knowing they were next. How long between their disappearance and death? She asked. Based on stomach contents and other factors, I'd estimate they were alive for at least 4 to 6 hours after their last meal. The party food was still being digested. They'd been kept alive for hours, held somewhere, terrorized. Dr. Reeves, the crawl space where they were found, could 4 bodies have been placed there on the same day they disappeared? Unlikely. The space would have required excavation, preparation. The concrete floor above would have needed to be cut and replaced. That's hours of work, maybe a full day, and it would have been noisy. So Samuel Finch held them somewhere else initially, Chief Brennan said, having entered Laura's office. Killed them, then buried them later when he had time to prepare the crawl space. That means there's another crime scene, Laura said. Somewhere he took them, somewhere he felt safe enough to hold 4 people captive for hours, somewhere with industrial carpeting. She turned to Marcus. Pull property records for Samuel Finch. Any buildings he owned, rented, had access to. Check his father's properties, too. Harold might have owned places Samuel could use. As Marcus left to begin the search, Laura looked at the evidence board she'd been building on her office wall. Photographs of the Whitmore family, the community center, the crime scene, timeline notes in red marker, a web of connections slowly forming. Samuel Finch was dead, beyond the reach of justice. But Laura wasn't investigating to prosecute him anymore. She was investigating to understand what had happened in those missing hours, to give the Whitmore family's final moments the dignity of being known, and to answer the question that kept her awake at night. Had Samuel Finch really acted alone, or had someone else helped him pull off the perfect disappearance? The property records arrived on Laura's desk the following morning in a thick manila envelope. Marcus had worked late into the night compiling everything connected to Samuel Finch and his father Harold. Laura spread the documents across her desk, studying each one carefully. Samuel Finch had never owned property in his own name. He'd rented a series of apartments and houses over the years, moving frequently, never staying anywhere longer than 18 months. But his father Harold had been more established. Harold Finch had owned the family home on Maple Street where Samuel had lived on and off throughout his adult life. He'd also owned a commercial property on the outskirts of town, a former printing facility that had gone out of business in 1987. According to the records, Harold had purchased it intending to convert it into a storage facility, but the project had never materialized. The building had sat vacant from 1987 until Harold's death in 2003, when it was sold to a developer who eventually tore it down to build a strip mall. Laura felt her pulse quicken. A vacant commercial building with industrial space. Somewhere Samuel would have had access through his father. Somewhere isolated enough to hold captives without being noticed. She called the county records office and requested building plans for the old printing facility. While waiting for them to be pulled from archives, she drove out to the strip mall that now occupied the site. The location was perfect for what Samuel would have needed. Set back from the main road, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. In 1992, the nearest occupied building would have been nearly a quarter-mile away. Someone could have screamed for hours without being heard. Laura walked the parking lot, trying to visualize what had stood here before. The strip mall was bland and modern. A coffee shop, a dry cleaner, a nail salon. But beneath her feet, according to the property maps, had been a 2-story brick building with a basement level. A basement. Isolated. Soundproof. Her phone rang. Chief Brennan's voice was tight with urgency. "Laura, you need to get back here. We've got someone who wants to talk. Says she has information about the Whitmore case." 20 minutes later, Laura sat across from a woman named Patricia Vance in the station's interview room. Patricia was 58, her gray hair cut short, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Marcus had brought her. "I saw the press conference," Patricia began, her voice unsteady, "and I couldn't sleep. I've been telling myself for 23 years that what I saw didn't matter, that I must have been mistaken. But those children, they deserve the truth." Laura activated the recording device. "Please tell me what you saw, Ms. Vance." Patricia took a shaky breath. "I was driving home from work on May 16, 1992. I worked as a nurse at Pine Ridge Hospital. Second shift. Ended. At 4 o'clock. I took County Road 47 because it was the fastest route to my house." Laura knew County Road 47. It ran past the old printing facility. Around 4:15, I saw a blue pickup truck pulled off on the side of the road near the old Finch printing building. The building was abandoned, so seeing any vehicle there was unusual. I slowed down, wondering if someone needed help. Patricia's hands tightened around the coffee cup. That's when I saw him dragging something toward the building's side entrance. At first, I thought it was a carpet or furniture, but then I realized it was a person. A woman, I think. She was wrapped in something, not moving. And behind him, the truck bed had what looked like bundles, covered with a tarp. Laura leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Did you get a good look at the man?" "Not his face, but he was tall, dark-haired, wearing work clothes. When he saw my car, he stopped and just stared at me. I got scared and drove away. I told myself he was probably just moving furniture, that it was none of my business." "Why didn't you report this?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Because I was afraid. And then, when the Whitmores went missing, I thought about that truck, those bundles, but I convinced myself it couldn't be connected. The timing was close, but the printing building was in the opposite direction from the community center. How could it be related? Did you recognize the truck? Laura asked. At the time, no, but years later, after Samuel Finch died in that accident, they showed his truck on the news. It was the same truck. Blue Ford F-150, older model. I recognized the dent in the passenger door. Laura pulled out a photo array, including Samuel Finch's picture among 5 others. Can you identify the man you saw? Patricia studied the photos, then pointed to Samuel with a trembling finger. That's him, I'm certain. After Patricia left, Laura immediately obtained a warrant to search the county records for any remaining evidence from the old printing facility. The building had been demolished in 2004, but the county had been required to conduct environmental surveys before the demolition. Those surveys included photographs of the interior. Laura spent the rest of the afternoon poring over grainy images of the abandoned building. Empty rooms with peeling paint, broken windows. And in the basement, a large open space with industrial carpet still partially intact on the floor. Industrial carpet. The same type of fibers found on the Whitmore family's clothing. The basement photos also showed evidence of water damage and deterioration. But in one corner, Laura noticed something that made her breath catch. A section of the carpet appeared cleaner than the surrounding area, as if it had been replaced or scrubbed aggressively. She called Dr. Reeves. The fiber analysis from the victim's clothing. Can you determine the age of those fibers? We can approximate based on the synthetic composition and degradation. Patterns. Why? Because I think I found where Samuel Finch held them before he killed them. And I need to know if those fibers match the timeline. By evening, Dr. Reeves had her answer. The carpet fibers dated to approximately 1985 to 1990, consistent with industrial-grade carpeting manufactured during that period. The composition matched exactly the type of carpet visible in the basement photographs. Laura sat alone in her office as darkness fell outside, studying the evidence board she'd expanded across an entire wall. The timeline was becoming clear. Samuel Finch had been stalking the Whitmore family for weeks, maybe months. He'd watched their daughters at soccer practice. He'd made harassing phone calls to their home. He'd learned their routines, their patterns. On May 16th, he'd positioned himself at the community center, measuring the floor, preparing for what would come later. When the Whitmores walked to their car, a routine, innocent moment, he'd somehow lured or forced them behind the maintenance shed where his truck waited on the service road. He'd transported them to the abandoned printing facility his father owned, held them in the basement, killed them there, methodically, one by one. Then he'd prepared the crawl space at the community center, cutting through the floor, excavating the space, creating a hidden tomb. He'd buried them beneath the building where they'd celebrated their daughter's last birthday, where the town had gathered for years afterward, never knowing the Whitmores lay beneath their feet. But something still didn't fit. Samuel Finch had been alone when Patricia Vance saw him dragging the first victim into the building. But 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children, required control, required logistics, required help, or at minimum, extensive preparation. Laura turned to her computer and began searching for any associates of Samuel Finch, anyone who might have helped him that day. The work carried her deep into the night, the station quiet around her except for the overnight dispatcher in the front office. At 2 a.m., she found something in the old personnel records from the Parks and Recreation Department. In early 1992, Samuel Finch had been assigned a helper for renovation projects at the community center, someone to assist with the heavy work of cutting through floors and moving materials. The name on the work order made Laura's blood run cold. Peter Chen, the maintenance worker who'd left Pine Ridge in the late 1990s. The same man Chief Brennan had mentioned still lived in Portland. Laura pulled up current records and found an address. Peter Chen, now 63, residing in a quiet Portland suburb. She looked at the clock. Too late to call Brennan, too early to wait. This couldn't wait. At 2:30 a.m., Laura was in her car, driving toward Portland through the darkness, the case file on the passenger seat beside her. If Peter Chen had helped Samuel Finch, if he'd been part of murdering the Whitmore family, he'd managed to escape justice for 23 years. But the dead beneath the community center floor were finally speaking. And Laura was listening. Laura reached Portland just before dawn. She'd called Chief Brennan from the road, briefing him on what she'd found. He'd authorized her to make contact with Peter Chen, with Portland Police Department backup standing by. The house on Willow Creek Drive was a modest split level in a neighborhood of similar homes, lawns neatly maintained, cars parked in driveways. Utterly ordinary. The kind of place where neighbors waved to each other and children rode bicycles on quiet streets. Laura waited until 7 a.m., wanting to avoid startling Chen but unwilling to delay any longer. 2 Portland police officers parked a block away, ready to respond if needed. Peter Chen answered the door in a bathrobe, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes widening when he saw Laura's badge. "Mr. Chen, I'm Detective Laura Chen with Pine Ridge Police Department. I need to speak with you about your employment with the Parks and Recreation Department in the early 1990s. Something shifted in Peter's expression, not quite fear, but resignation. "I wondered when someone would come, after I heard they found bodies under the community center." He stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The interior of the house was tidy but impersonal. The furniture functional rather than decorative. No photographs on the walls, no personal mementos visible. It felt like a place someone lived in but didn't truly inhabit. Peter led her to a small kitchen table and sat down heavily. "I've been waiting 23 years for this conversation. Tell me about Samuel Finch," Laura said, setting her recorder on the table. Peter stared at his hands. "Sam and I worked together on renovation projects at the community center in 1991 and early 1992. His father Harold assigned us to work as a team. Sam knew construction, and I was good with electrical and plumbing." What was Samuel like? Quiet, intense. He had this way of watching people that made you uncomfortable. We didn't talk much while we worked, which suited me fine. I was just trying to earn a paycheck. Peter stood abruptly, moving to the kitchen counter. He pulled a bottle of whiskey from a cabinet and poured a shot, downing it despite the early hour. Laura didn't comment. In March of 1992, Sam started talking about the floor in the northwest corner of the building, said he'd noticed it wasn't level, that we should reinforce it. Harold approved the work. We spent 2 weeks on it, pulled up the old flooring, reinforced the joists, installed new subfloor. That's when the crawl space was created, Laura said. Peter nodded, pouring another shot but not drinking it yet. At the time, I thought we were just fixing a structural issue. Sam did most of the measurements, most of the planning. I followed his lead. When we finished, we sealed everything back up. It looked perfect. What happened on May 16th? Peter's hand shook as he lifted the shot glass. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd taken the day off to go fishing. But around noon, Sam called my apartment. Said Harold needed us to fix a problem at the center before a birthday party that afternoon. Said it was urgent. Laura's instincts sharpened. Did you go? I drove out there around 1:30. Sam was already there with his truck. He said the problem was outside, behind the maintenance shed. Asked me to help him move something from his truck. Peter drained the shot glass, his face pale. When I got around behind the shed, I saw them. The Whitmore family. They were in the back of his truck, unconscious. All 4 of them. He drugged them somehow. I don't know how or when, but they were breathing just out cold. Laura felt ice in her veins. What did you do? I panicked. I started backing away, saying I wanted nothing to do with it. Sam pulled a gun. Told me I was already part of it because I'd helped build the crawl space. Said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure the police thought I was the one who'd taken the family. Peter's voice broke. He made me help him load them into his truck. One was already in the cab. We drove them to the old printing facility. He had everything set up in the basement, rope, tape, tools. He'd planned it all. "Did you help him kill them?" Laura asked, her voice hard. "No," Peter said vehemently. "God, no. He locked me in a room upstairs. I could hear them crying, the little girls calling for their mother. I pounded on the door, screaming for him to stop. But the walls were thick. He'd soundproofed them somehow." Tears streamed down Peter's face now. Hours later, it got quiet. Sam unlocked the door and made me help him wrap the bodies. Made me drive his truck while he followed in my car. We brought them back to the community center after dark. The party was long over. The building was empty. "You helped bury them," Laura stated. Peter nodded miserably. He had the crawl space already partially opened. We put them down there, covered them, sealed the floor back. By sunrise, you couldn't tell anything had been disturbed. Then Sam threatened me. Said if I ever talked, he'd make sure my sister and her kids disappeared the same way. "Why didn't you come forward after Samuel died in 1998? "Because I was guilty," Peter said simply. "I helped him. I didn't pull the trigger or swing whatever he used to kill them, but I moved their bodies. I buried them. I kept his secret. What jury would believe I was forced? I was a coward, detective. I ran to Portland, changed jobs, tried to forget. But you never forget something like that." Laura sat back, processing everything. Peter Chen had been complicit, but whether under duress or willingly would require more investigation. "Mr. Chen, I need you to come back to Pine Ridge and make a formal statement." "Will I be arrested?" "That decision will be made by the district attorney. But you've withheld evidence in a quadruple homicide for 23 years. There will be consequences." Peter nodded, looking almost relieved. "I understand. Maybe it's time I finally faced what I did. And what I didn't do." Laura called Chief Brennan with an update, then waited while Peter packed a small bag. The Portland officers would transport him to Pine Ridge while Laura followed in her own vehicle. As she drove south through the morning traffic, Laura pieced together the final timeline. Samuel Finch had drugged the Whitmore family somehow, probably at the party itself, though proving that now would be impossible. When they'd walked to their car, he'd been waiting behind the maintenance shed with his truck. He'd loaded them while they were unconscious, made it look like they'd simply walked away. The witnesses who'd seen them go behind the shed had assumed they'd continued to the service road and out of sight. In reality, they'd never walked anywhere. They'd been carried into Samuel's truck while unconscious and driven to their deaths. But one question still haunted Laura. How had Samuel drugged 4 people at a crowded party without anyone noticing? She thought about the timeline, about who had access to the family's food and drinks, about who had been near them in those crucial minutes before they'd walked to their car. And suddenly, she remembered something from Jennifer Hayes' interview, something that hadn't seemed significant at the time. Jennifer had mentioned that the Whitmores had been eating birthday cake samples. Claire had ordered several flavors, and they'd been tasting them during the party to decide which one to serve. Cake samples, brought from an outside bakery. Laura pulled over at a rest stop and called Marcus. "I need you to find out which bakery provided the cake for the Whitmore party. Check old business licenses, tax records, anything from 1992. 3 hours later, as Laura arrived back at Pine Ridge Station with Peter Chen in custody, Marcus had an answer. The cake had been ordered from Finch Family Bakery, a small shop Harold Finch had owned as a side business in the early 1990s. A bakery where Samuel Finch had worked part-time, where Samuel would have had access to the cake samples delivered to the party, where he could have laced them with sedatives before they were ever served. The pieces were finally falling into place. Samuel Finch hadn't just planned the abduction. He'd orchestrated every detail, from building the hidden grave months in advance to drugging his victims at their own daughter's birthday celebration. He'd made 4 people vanish in plain sight, and for 23 years he'd gotten away with it. But the community center floor had finally betrayed his secret, and the Whitmore family could finally rest, their story told, their killers' methods exposed for the calculated evil they were. The interrogation room at Pine Ridge Police Department felt smaller than usual, with 5 people crowded inside. Peter Chen sat across from Laura and Chief Brennan, his attorney, a public defender from Portland, beside him. The district attorney, Margaret Walsh, observed from the corner, her expression unreadable. Peter's formal statement took 3 hours. He recounted every detail he could remember about May 16, 1992, his voice growing hoarser as he described the sounds of the Whitmore family's final hours. The little girls crying for their mother, Thomas Whitmore pleading for his daughters' lives, Claire's muffled screams before the silence came. "Samuel made me listen," Peter said, his face ashen. "He wanted me to understand what would happen to my sister's children if I ever talked. He opened the door to that room just enough so I could hear everything." Laura's stomach turned, but she kept her expression neutral. "Did Samuel tell you why he targeted the Whitmore family?" Peter shook his head. "Not really. He said once that some people were put on earth to be taken, that he could see it in them. That Claire Whitmore had looked at him with pity once when he was working at the community center, and he hated being pitied more than anything. The banality of evil. A woman's kind expression had marked her entire family for death. "Tell me about the bakery," Laura said. "How did Samuel have access to the cake samples?" "His father owned the bakery as a side business. Samuel worked there sometimes when he needed money. He told me afterward that he'd injected the cake samples with veterinary sedatives he'd stolen from a clinic outside town. Said it was simple, just a small syringe, a tiny hole that sealed itself in the frosting." "How many samples did he dose?" "4, 1 for each of them. He watched during the party to make sure they ate them. The sedatives were timed to take effect about 30 minutes later. By the time they got to the car, they were already getting drowsy and disoriented. Behind the shed, they collapsed. Easy to load into his truck." Margaret Walsh leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, you stated that Samuel Finch forced you to help at gunpoint, yet you had opportunities to escape, to call for help. The printing facility had phones. You could have run when you were driving Samuel's truck. Why didn't you?" Peter's hands clenched on the table. "Because I believed him when he said he'd kill my family. You didn't know Sam. He was patient, methodical. He'd proven he could make 4 people disappear without a trace. My sister lived 300 miles away, but I knew he'd find a way, and I was terrified." "Fear isn't an excuse for accessory to murder," Walsh said coldly. "I know," Peter whispered. "I've known that for 23 years. After the statement was complete, and Peter had been processed into a holding cell, Laura met with Walsh and Brennan in the chief's office. "What are you charging him with?" Laura asked. Walsh tapped her pen against her notepad. 4 counts of accessory to murder after the fact. Obstruction of justice. Possibly more once I review the full evidence. He helped dispose of bodies, helped conceal evidence. The coercion defense might reduce his sentence, but he's looking at significant prison time." "He was threatened," Laura began. "And then Samuel Finch died 17 years ago," Walsh interrupted. Yet Mr. Chen remained silent. The moment Samuel died, the threat died with him. Peter Chen chose to continue covering up these murders for nearly 2 more decades. That's a choice, Detective, not coercion. Laura couldn't argue with that logic, though she felt a complicated sympathy for the broken man in the holding cell. Peter Chen had been weak, not evil, but weakness in the face of evil had its own consequences. Over the next week, the investigation expanded its scope. Armed with Peter's testimony and search warrants, the county excavated the site of the former printing facility. In the location Peter described as the basement where the murders occurred, forensic teams found residual blood evidence in the concrete foundation that had survived the building's demolition. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to the Whitmore family. They also found, buried in the woods behind where the building had stood, a metal toolbox containing items Samuel Finch had kept as trophies: Thomas Whitmore's wedding ring, Claire's driver's license, 2 small hair ribbons that matched the ones Emma and Sophie had worn in photographs from the birthday party. The evidence was overwhelming, conclusive. Even with Samuel Finch dead and beyond earthly justice, the case could finally be closed with certainty about what had happened. Laura stood in the evidence room, looking at those small hair ribbons preserved in clear bags, and felt the full weight of what those 7-year-old girls had endured. They'd watched their parents die. They'd known they were next. and their last hours had been filled with terror that no child should ever experience. On a cold November afternoon, Laura attended a press conference where Chief Brennan announced that the Whitmore homicide investigation was officially closed. Samuel Finch had been identified as the perpetrator. Peter Chen would face trial for his role. The community could finally have answers after 23 years of uncertainty. But Laura knew that answers weren't the same as closure. The Whitmores were still dead. Emma and Sophie had still never grown up, never graduated high school, never fell in love, never lived the lives they deserved. Justice delayed was still justice denied. That evening, Laura visited the Pine Ridge Cemetery where the Whitmore family would be buried together in a private ceremony scheduled for the following week. The plots had been purchased years ago by Thomas's mother, who had died in 1999, still believing her son and grandchildren might someday come home. 4 headstones stood ready, the names already carved. Thomas Edward Whitmore, Claire Marie Whitmore, Emma Rose Whitmore, Sophie Grace Whitmore. Below each name would be added the same dates, born in different years, but all sharing the same date of death, May 16, 1992. Laura placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of where the girls' headstones would soon rest. Spring flowers, because it had been spring when they died, when their 7th birthday became their last day. "I'm sorry it took so long," she whispered to the empty plots. "I'm sorry we didn't find you in time to catch the man who did this, but you're not forgotten. You were never forgotten." A voice behind her made Laura turn. Jennifer Hayes stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the November chill. "I come here sometimes," Jennifer said quietly, approaching to stand beside Laura. "Even before there were graves, just to feel close to them somehow." "I'm sorry this is how it ended," Laura said. Jennifer shook her head. "It ended the day they walked behind that shed. We just didn't know it yet. At least now we know. At least now they can be put to rest properly, together." They stood in silence for a moment. 2 women separated by age and experience, but united in grief for a family stolen by senseless evil. "Claire was supposed to come to book club the Tuesday after the party," Jennifer said, her voice distant with memory. "We were reading The Secret Garden. She never got to finish it. I still have her copy at my house. I couldn't bring myself to return it to the library." Laura placed a hand on Jennifer's shoulder. "Bring it to the funeral. Leave it with her. Let her take that piece of her life with her." Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face. She would have liked that. As darkness fell and Laura drove back to the station, she thought about Samuel Finch, about the empty life he'd led, the isolation he'd chosen, the darkness he'd nurtured until it consumed not just himself, but 4 innocent people. He'd died drunk behind the wheel 6 years after the murders, his truck wrapped around a tree on a rainy night. Quick, probably painless, while the Whitmores had died slowly, terrified, in a basement where no one could hear them scream. Sometimes, Laura thought, there was no such thing as justice. Just the small consolation of truth finally revealed. The funeral took place on a gray November morning, clouds heavy with rain that never quite fell. Most of Pine Ridge turned out for the service. People who had known the Whitmores, people who had only heard the stories, people who simply needed to witness the end of their town's darkest mystery. The 4 caskets were small, or at least the girls' caskets were. Laura stood at the back of the crowd gathered at Pine Ridge Cemetery, watching as Pastor Williams from First Methodist Church conducted the service. Thomas Whitmore's elderly brother spoke, his voice breaking as he described a family full of life and love. Jennifer Hayes read a passage from The Secret Garden, Claire's favorite book, and the principal of Riverside Elementary, where Emma and Sophie would have been in their senior year of high school had they lived, planted a maple tree in their honor. The tree would be transplanted to the school grounds, where it would grow tall and strong, providing shade for generations of children who would never know the twins who should have graduated with them. As the crowd dispersed after the burial, Laura noticed Martin Oakes standing apart from the others, leaning heavily on a cane. He'd been released on his own recognizance pending charges that would likely be reduced given his age and cooperation. His face was drawn, aged beyond his 71 years. Laura approached him. "Mr. Oakes." "Detective." He nodded toward the fresh graves. "I should have spoken up. All those years they were in the ground while their family wondered. I should have found the courage." "Fear is a powerful thing," Laura said, though she couldn't quite keep the judgment from her voice. "It is," Martin agreed. "But so is guilt. I've lived with both for 23 years. Maybe prison will be easier." He walked away slowly, a broken man who would carry his choices to his own grave. Peter Chen had been denied bail and awaited trial from the county jail. His attorney was negotiating a plea deal, 15 to 20 years in exchange for his cooperation and testimony about Samuel Finch's methods. At 63, Peter would likely die in prison, but at least he'd be alive to die. The Whitmores hadn't had that luxury. That afternoon, Laura returned to the station to finish her final report. The case file would be massive. Thousands of pages of testimony, evidence analysis, forensic reports. Future investigators would study it, learning from the mistakes made in 1992 when limited technology and a clever killer had resulted in 23 years of unanswered questions. Chief Brennan appeared in her doorway. "You did good work on this, Laura. Gave that family the justice they deserved." "Did I?" Laura asked, looking up from her computer. "Samuel Finch is dead. He never faced trial, never answered for what he did. Peter Chen will go to prison, but he was a coward, not a murderer. Martin Oakes might serve a year or two at most for obstruction. Where's the justice in that?" Brennan settled into the chair across from her desk. "Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth. The Whitmore's family knows what happened now. The community knows. Those girls aren't missing anymore. They're home, buried beside their parents, their graves marked, their memory honored." "It's not enough," Laura said quietly. "No," Brennan agreed. "It never is." Over the following weeks, the media coverage gradually faded. The Whitmore case became part of Pine Ridge's history rather than its present. The strip mall where the printing facility had stood continued its ordinary business. The elementary school planted the maple tree in a ceremony attended by dozens of former classmates of Emma and Sophie. And life went on, as it always did, even in the shadow of tragedy. Laura drove past the site where the community center had stood, now cleared and waiting for construction of the new recreational facility. The town council had voted to name it the Whitmore Family Community Center. A plaque would be installed, remembering the family and ensuring they would never be forgotten. Small consolations. Laura had learned in her years as a detective that sometimes small consolations were all you got. Sometimes evil won in the moment, and justice came too late to matter to the victims. But it mattered to the living. It mattered to the children who would play in that new community center, growing up in a town that remembered what had happened and worked to ensure it never happened again. It mattered to the classmates who would sit beneath that maple tree, perhaps never knowing its significance but benefiting from its shade nonetheless. And it mattered to Laura, who had given the Whitmore family their voices back, who had ensured their last hours were finally understood and their killer's identity revealed. On a cold December evening, Laura visited the cemetery one final time before the case officially closed. The headstones were in place now, the graves settled, fresh flowers already wilting in the winter chill. She knelt beside the girls' markers, placing 2 small teddy bears against the cold granite. "Happy birthday, Emma and Sophie," she whispered. "You would have been 31 today." The wind carried her words away, across the cemetery and out toward Mirror Lake, where the water reflected the dimming sky, where 23 years ago, 2 7-year-old girls had celebrated their last birthday, never knowing that their laughter and joy would end before the cake was ever cut. Laura stood, pulling her coat tighter against the cold, and walked back to her car. Behind her, the teddy bears sat sentinel against the headstones, keeping watch over the graves of children who had never grown up. The Whitmore family was finally at rest, and Pine Ridge, Oregon, could begin the slow process of healing from the wound that had festered at its heart for over 2 decades. Some scars never fully healed. Some losses were too profound to overcome. But remembering mattered. Truth mattered. And ensuring that Emma and Sophie Whitmore were more than just names on missing person posters, that they were real girls who had lived and laughed and deserved so much more than they'd been given. That mattered most of all. As Laura drove home through the darkening streets of Pine Ridge, she carried with her the weight of 4 lives stolen, 4 caskets buried, and the knowledge that sometimes the only justice possible was the stubborn refusal to forget. The Whitmores would not be forgotten. Their story had been told, and in the telling, perhaps they had finally found the peace that had been denied them for 23 years.